Most of us run out of money at one time or another, and more often than not, it's just as we're settling into our stride. Yet property's a money-hungry game, and the more we have of it, the quicker we can seize opportunities and start to grow.
That's why it's so important to have different sources of finance available to you and to understand the different situations in which each can be most effective. In this video, we're going to run through 10 sources of finance, some of which are extremely simple and some that are a little bit more involved that we use day in, day out pretty much to fund all of our property projects. And we also recorded this as a podcast probably a few weeks back where we went into a bit more detail on each of them. So if you want that detail or you prefer listening to something rather than watching a video, I'll make sure we post a link to that podcast episode in the comments under this video.
Equity is one of the cheapest and easiest sources of finance available, so it's well worth checking if you have it. The first step would be to contact your existing lender and ask about a further advance, which is an additional sum that can be added onto your mortgage without the need to refinance. Most residential lenders will offer this service.
If that's not an option for you, then it's worth seeing if there's anything else that you can do. First thing I would be doing is looking to see what term is left on your mortgage, and if it's up for renewal fairly soon, you maybe just have to wait a couple of months and then release equity by switching to another mortgage provider. If that's still not an option, maybe it's a good few years before you're exempt from any early repayment charges, then the third way to release equity from your house could be a second charge loan. Now this is very similar to a mortgage, but they will take a second charge, obviously in the name, on the property. So your mortgage lender will continue with the first charge, then a second lender, completely separate from your original mortgage lender, will lend you an additional sum of money, increasing the loan to value, and they'll take that second charge on the property. This is typically a more expensive way of doing things. It could be maybe 8% or so per annum that you'd be paying on that debt, but it could still be a lot cheaper than other sources of finance like bridging loans, so worth considering and checking out. Now for us, we used some of our finance from our very first property actually to go from one property in our portfolio to two by refinancing, right? I'd lived in it for a couple of years, and just through capital appreciation and doing some work to that, we were able to release maybe about £30,000 from that first one.
Yeah, enough for a deposit on the second one, certainly, that allowed us to springboard and go from one to two.
Yeah, and we've done that time and time again, but even going from that first step to the second step, if you're sitting in your own home just now hoping to get your first buy to let, that could be a great option for you.
Next, it's time to apply those exact same strategies to your investment portfolio. Typically, you'll start with the properties where the value has increased the most since you bought them. Now, this can be through two things. One, capital appreciation, or two, because you have added value by doing the property up. Now, this is our bread and butter when it comes to raising finance. We buy a property, we do it up, we refinance and pull the funds out.
Yeah, and as we said in the last one, refinancing your own home, similar here. We have done this umpteen times on virtually every property, and it has been the number one driver for us being able to grow our portfolio, I would say. So again, well worth doing it. If you are adding value to a property, try to get an initial short-term deal, either for 2 years or ideally a product with no early repayment charges at all. So once you have renovated the property, you can refinance it straight away and release as much of that capital back out as possible. Next up are credit cards, and I know a lot of people are scared of them, but actually they can be one of the cheapest sources of finance. Now, typically you're not going to be able to use this to pay deposits on a property, although Victoria might say something against that in a moment. You'd normally be looking to use this for the renovations, particularly if you're funding big purchases of materials through places like Magnet for your kitchens or anywhere else that you've got a big bill from a large company that will accept credit cards. The reason I say they're one of the cheapest sources of finance is because very often, if you've got a reasonable credit score, you'll be able to get 0% interest deals for anything from 6 up to 18, 24 months, meaning that as long as you pay the debt back within that period of time, it won't have cost you a penny.
So like Mike says, typically you are just using credit cards to fund work, but actually we do have an example where we were able to secure a property via credit card. So the property didn't sell at auction. The auction house rang us the next day because they knew we were interested, and they allowed us to pay a holding fee, a 5% holding fee for that property on credit card, which helped us out.
Yeah, it did work out really well. And again, we use them regularly when we're getting towards the end of projects and cash flow might be a little bit tight. but obviously trying to keep those 0% deals as low as possible. One card that we use in particular is the British Airways American Express Avios card. Basically, for every pound you spend, you get a number of air miles. And we tend to go on quite a few holidays, but a lot of them are funded through business class flights that we have got as a reward from this American Express business card. And when you're using it for property expenses or any sort of company expenses, they rack up extremely quickly. So again, we'll put a link to that credit card below. Little disclaimer here, we get I think a referral bonus of 20,000 Avios or something if you choose to go for one, but I think you also get a welcome bonus of Avios as well to get you started. So if you're looking to start flying around the world in business class for free as a result of your property business, then well worth checking it out. Now, one caveat to put in here when we're talking about things like credit cards and personal loans is that typically your credit score will need to be in good shape to get these types of offers. If you're watching this and your credit score isn't in good shape, then honestly my personal view would be to stop thinking about property investing for this moment in time anyway, and certainly stop thinking about things like credit cards and loans and bridging finance and all that sort of stuff, because that will just make your debt situation worse. What I would suggest in that case is get your own personal finances in order, build up your credit score at the same time, and then start to look at some of these more creative ways of finance, because it can be a slippery slope, and if you're not on the ball with paying off these 0% credit cards in time or making all your loan payments on time, it will just get worse. So yeah, little caveat there, make sure your own personal credit is in good shape before you start thinking about using more debt to try and build an income.
Like credit cards, personal loans are also a very cheap way to borrow. So a quick search online, a website like Money Saving Expert will show loans ranging from $15,000 up to $25,000 for an annual interest rate of about 3%. It's worth noting as well that up to $25,000, typically these loans are unsecured, so you don't need to give security on any other assets that you own. However, they will show up against your credit score. So if you're thinking of applying for a mortgage anytime soon, that is something that will pop up when they credit check you.
Again, personal loans are something that we've used from time to time, and again, as Victoria said, they are extremely cheap. I think we once needed money for something, renovations, or we had a builder to pay within a couple of weeks or something like that, and through our own personal bank we went on quick application, and I think within about 5 minutes we had 20 grand deposited in our account over a 5-year term, and it cost us something like £1,000 for the 5 years to borrow that 20 grand, so very cheap. Someone else who has put this into great practice in the recent future is a guy called Dan Brown. We're going to hear from him shortly on how he listened to the podcast that I mentioned earlier that we recorded, and with credit cards and loans has been able to raise a significant chunk of money towards his next project as well.
Hi guys and gals, Dan here from Abibo Homes, hope you're all well. Recently read an article on the Inside Property Investing website regarding the 10 ways to finance your next deal, and thought it was extremely interesting. We love working with investors, giving them a fantastic return on their investment, but the thought of getting some low or zero interest money was very appealing. Looked into credit cards and personal loans. 2 weeks later, managed to secure £50,000 at 0% interest and £30,000 at 3.5%. So that's going towards the development costs on one of our projects, which was absolutely lovely. Thanks for the heads up, guys, and great article.
So bridging is a shorter term loan secured against the property. It's very similar to a mortgage insofar as it involves an application, it involves a valuation of the property, but the real difference is the length of time. So bridging is typically up to 12 months, whereas mortgages, as you know, tend to be 3-year fixes onwards. Bridging is also a lot more expensive, and you can typically expect to pay around 1% interest per month for the duration of the bridge. It is worth pointing out that bridging is the correct product to use if you are going to do serious renovation to a property. So you could be breaching your mortgage terms and conditions if you completely renovate a property. However, bridging allows for that, and that is the recommended product.
So typically the product that we would start on when we are converting residential house into an HMO, or even a commercial premises into an HMO, or apartments, or whatever we choose to do with it. And more these days as well, there are lenders, typically the more commercially focused lenders, who are offering a bridge to term product, meaning you get bridging for 6, 8, 12 months, whatever you need it for, with a sort of pre-approved term mortgage product tagged onto the end of it with the same company, which can make the transition from the bridge to the mortgage a little bit quicker and easier and save you a few pounds. So worth looking into those sorts of things as well.
Yep.
Similar to bridging, development finance is again intended to be short-term finance to help you with the costs of buying and renovating or building on land or a building or something along those lines. Now, bridging is typically lent against the value of the property as it stands in that point in time, and with renovation or construction works being so expensive, often it doesn't go far enough to fund the whole project. Development finance, on the other hand, can be based on the GDV, the gross development value of the project. So let's say, for instance, you're looking to buy land for £100,000. A bridging company would typically come in and value that at £100,000 and lend you 60, 70, 75% of that £100,000. A development finance company, on the other hand, let's say that £100,000 parcel of land also had planning permission in place for 5 apartments that would each be worth £100,000 once it's complete. They would look at that 500,000 GDV and lend you a percentage of that, potentially, depending on your track record, depending on how realistic those end valuations are, so on and so forth, your credit score, who's part of your team, and all that sort of stuff. But there is potential to raise more money with development finance. So again, it's expensive. Again, it's intended to be short term, but for the right project, it can be a real lifesaver.
And I guess the only downside to think about when considering development finance is whilst the money is released in tranches, it is typically in arrears, which means a chunk of work needs to be complete before the development finance company pay you back for that chunk of work. So you are going to need a chunk of cash to get started on the project.
Now, if you think it's risky borrowing money from banks, then it is significantly more so when you start borrowing money from individuals, particularly if they are friends or family. Not that you should be any less careful borrowing money from strangers. As well as impacting your own finances and most likely their finances as well, you also run the risk of ruining relationships if things go south. So you need to have the utmost confidence, not just in the deal, but in yourself and your ability to deliver as well.
That being said, a well-timed loan from a family member or a friend has been the starting point for many of the podcast past guests, and indeed it's really helped us out a few times in the past as well. It doesn't need to be a huge amount, sometimes as little as £5,000-10,000 can be the real difference between being able to do one deal at once or two, getting a deal over the finishing line, anything really. It just can really make a difference to your property investing.
Even with more basic strategies as well, it does, like you say, it doesn't need to be enough to pay a deposit on an entire property, which could be £50,000 or more. It could be first few deposits and furniture packs on a rent-to-rent deal. It could be marketing budget for running some Facebook campaigns to do some deal sourcing. Whatever it is, it can be enough to get you started if you're creative about how you use that.
So to give an example here, and it's a story I've told so many times before, Michael and I had been together a couple of years at this point, but I was really adamant that I wanted to do a deal entirely in my own name. But I didn't have that much in the way of funds. I had a few £1,000s in the bank account. So I found a property that was for sale for £60,000. This was quite a few years ago and it was up in the northeast. I had £6,000 in savings, so that covered my 10% deposit. My father then lent me £10,000 and I got a £10,000 loan from one of the big supermarkets that offers finance. And that funded the entire renovation. All I needed was £6,000, which I had, and the rest of the renovation came from personal loans and family members. We renovated the property, I flipped it, I sold it on, and I made over £20,000 profit, which then took my own pot of money from £6,000 to £26,000. Really quite simply.
Now, the reason we differentiate between loans from friends and family and private investors is because in our own heads, and I think in reality, they are very different beasts. Friends and family, it's more of a goodwill gesture and a support to help you get started. It's a lot less structured, and in a lot of cases, friends or family, particularly if it's a close family member, may not be looking for anything in return. That pot of money will run out at some point though, which is when you then may start to look for similar sorts of sources of finance, but from other people. It could be people that you work with or contacts generally that you've made throughout life. They will typically be looking for a fixed return. It could be anything from 5 or 6% a year up to 10 or 12% a year. There's a story that you might know as well about us even offering 20% at one point, but we learned our lesson from that and moved on pretty quickly. The loan may or may not be secured. It may or may not be for a defined period of time. It is basically a blank sheet of paper that you are starting with, and you're coming to an agreement with another party for a sum of money for a period of time for an agreed rate of return, and as long as both parties are happy, then it can be another great way to source your next project.
Now, you might have people, be it friends or family, colleagues, complete strangers, who want to invest with you but don't quite have enough money to fund an entire deal, or they're nervous to give you a large sum of money to begin with. They might just have £5,000-10,000 that they're keen to invest.
Crowdfunding can be a solution for this, and whilst it's not a source of finance that we have used personally, we have explored it in quite a lot of detail. One of the biggest benefits is it wraps up raising money in a nice FCA compliant package. Someone else is taking care of all of the legal side of things, so that all you need to focus on is making sure you're doing the best deal possible and that you are marketing it in the best way possible. It can be quite an involved process because unlike personal loans or joint ventures where you're getting money from a small number of people, crowdfunding can be raising funds from dozens, if not hundreds, of different individuals, and typically it is your responsibility to attract them to the project. It is not the crowdfunding platform that are going to bring the investors to you, but it can be a great source of raising finance, particularly on deals that are a little bit alternative or more creative that the banks may not have an appetite for, but you know that it is going to be a good deal. And the other benefit of crowdfunding is that you have got all of these other people, including the crowdfunding company themselves, doing their own due diligence on their deals. So typically, if you're not able to raise the funds through crowdfunding, you might need to go back and revisit your deal because it maybe doesn't stack up as well as you thought it did anyway.
Now, joint venture can mean a multitude of things. The two common scenarios that people think of when it comes to JVs in the property world are scenario one, where one person puts in all the money and the other party brings all the time and expertise, or scenario two, where that's split 50-50 down the middle and both parties contribute equal funds and equal time and expertise. The one thing to think about if you are going to JV with somebody in property is that typically this is a long-lasting relationship that is going to go in quite some time, years if not decades, so you really need to trust the person that you team up with for a JV.
And again, as with a lot of these sources of finance, there is a lot of risk and concern from people saying that it's not the way that they want to go. I completely understand that, but from our point of view, joint ventures have probably been the most significant contribution to our success in property. A lot of the projects that we work on now, particularly the more sizable ones, are structured as joint ventures where we put in time and expertise, someone else funds them, we split the profits 50-50. So whilst some people would argue we're leaving 50% on the table, others would argue the investor's leaving 50% on the table, both parties in all of our situations are extremely happy with the output and they work very well for us. The final source of finance we want to mention, I guess, are really two separate sources of finance but linked somewhat: shares and pension pots. And if you've been in the corporate world for any length of time, one or both of these could be a great way for you to fund your next project. Particularly with share schemes, you may have built up a sizable pot there that can be accessed at any time, and obviously there may be tax implications, but worth exploring that because it often builds up without you really realizing it, except for the annual statement you get sent. Similarly, pensions can grow at a reasonable rate, and if you're in a well-paying job, again, that can be a sizable chunk of income, but accessing it can be a little bit more sensitive to the times that you want to do that. But as I said, if you've been in a corporate job, or maybe you've been in the forces or somewhere else that you've been building up either of these pots, then well worth exploring how you can access those funds to invest in property.
I hope this video has been useful for you, and if it has, we would really appreciate a thumbs up or a comment below letting us know what you think of it. Anything that we have mentioned, I will pop a link to in the description box below, so make sure you go and check that out. And like Mike said, there is a podcast that covers this as well, so give that a listen as well. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.